Right, hello. This is the third video in this series of GCSE revision videos brought to you by me, Ben, from All Sociology. And in today's video, what we're going to be looking at is about some of the key changes in families and family structures. So I'm up in my little corner, as I should be, and hopefully on the screen now you can start to see some of the topics that we're going to be looking at in this third video. So what we're going to be doing today is considering the changes in marriage and divorce rates over time, something I mentioned in the second video. And the most part of this is going to be me going over the reasons for those changes in marriage and divorce and consequently in family structures. I'll also then give you a couple of extra reasons that can be applied to why we've had family diversity, and we'll finish off by recapping the changes. So without further ado, let's have a look through the first bit we're going to study today. So I've got on the screen here the changes in marriages and divorces over the time. And the first line, this top line here, this is our marriage rate line. So we're going to concentrate on this one first of all. I'm just going to pull out a couple of key points in it. You can see, really, as sociologists, we're only really interested, see what this line is here? We're only really interested in stuff to the right of that line going along here. So we can see as it starts up there at about just under 400,000 or just over 400,000 in about 1970. We're down here to about roughly 250,000 today. So what has been some of the reasons for those changes? Well, the first thing we can talk about is the reason that the rate of marriage was so high initially, particularly at the end of the 1960s, is because of the baby boomer generation. So if you don't know what this is, you've probably heard of the phrase boomer on social media and stuff like that. A baby boomer is someone who was born just after the end of the Second World War. Now, if you go back, so if we've got 1970 here, go back about 25 years to the end of the Second World War, when all these kids were born. 25 years later, about the end of the 1960s, start of the 1970s, we had a huge amount of extra people in our population, and they were at that age where they started to get married. So that's really why we had started off with such a high peak there. And as time goes on, you can see it goes down and down and down and down. We have a couple of sort of peaks and troughs here and there, but the kind of thing that I want to pull out here is this little kick at the end there, just around 2014, and that is the impact of the Same-Sex Marriage Act. Now, just so you know, it doesn't equate to a huge amount of marriages per year. We're looking at something that's definitely under 10,000, about 8,000 marriages between same-sex couples a year, but it is enough to show a slight increase on that chart. Now, if we then start to look at the bottom line here, which is this slightly darker blue line, this is our divorce rate line. And again, we're only really interested in things from the right of about sort of 1970 onwards. Now, I'm going to pick out the key point here, which actually says on the graph there, Divorce Reform Act from 1969, effective from the 1st of January 1971. Now, this explains this big spike we have here, because you can see up until about the late 1960s, divorce rates are pretty low, certainly well under 100,000, about 50,000 or something like that. When the Divorce Reform Act came through, this allowed people to get divorced far more easily, and this is the real kicker that led to the growth or the rise of divorce over the course of the second half of the 20th century. But the other thing we should also be aware at is that, as I mentioned in the previous video, actually the rates today are, if I can bring my cursor, I've lost my cursor, there we go. The rates today are actually at their lowest since about 1971, where my cursor is now. And the peak was here in 1993, 165,000 divorces a year. So we've gone, divorce rates have gone up for sure since the late 1960s, but they have not hit the same heights as they did in the early 90s when they hit 165,000. Now, the main part of this video is me going to be now explaining what are the reasons for these changes. So why have we seen a decline in marriage, and why have we seen an increase in divorce? Well, to start off with explaining the decline in marriage, we can think about the alternatives that people do rather than getting married. So people now may choose to cohabit rather than marry. And this is the most common type of household in the UK now. So the fastest growing type of household in the UK today. Why do people live together without being married? Well, for all sorts of reasons. You might not know how much you actually love someone until you actually live with them. What happens if you don't like the amount of time they spend in the bathroom? What happens if they are incredibly messy? What happens if X, Y, Z? Yeah. So lots of people go through a process of cohabitation as almost like a trial marriage to see how it is actually living together. Can they and do they love each other as much when they're literally living on top of each other as they might do if they're in separate houses? The other reason people might cohabit is to avoid wedding costs as well. Now, don't always go for this as like your main reason, but absolutely it does play a part. So don't ever talk about why is marriage declined, oh, because weddings are expensive. Yes, that's true, but it's not necessarily a sociological reason. But you can add it in to the fact that people might try to do trial marriages, wait, see how they are, maybe save up some money for that wedding cost rather than getting married straight away. The other thing I mentioned in the last video as well is that alternative living situations are becoming increasingly common as well. So living on your own or living with friends, that can be for a whole host of reasons, but money also could come into that, particularly if you are living with friends. One of the other things about marriage is that people now marry a lot later in life. In fact, if we look at the statistics there, in 2012, only 14% of brides were aged under 25. But if you go back 50 years ago to 1968, this was 3/4 of them. So a massive, massive decline, or sort of massive decline in people getting married when they're young. But what sort of replaced that is the fact that actually now people either wait until they're older, or we have people getting married more than once in their lifetimes through remarriage. So what we often see sometimes is people get married, and then they, after a period of time, decide that they're going to get divorced. Sometimes that's a case of like when children have grown up, gone to university, or flown the nest, and then they decide, actually, this isn't really for us. We want a bit of, I want some sort of I want something that I actually want, rather than being with somebody that I'm just with just because we've had kids together. So we might have a rise in remarriage or serial monogamy, where people get married again, divorced, and get married again. And often we refer to this as silver weddings due to the colour of people's hair in their sort of 50s, 60s, and so on, who might get married later in life, possibly for the second, third, or even fourth times. And kind of tying all this together is this big trend towards individualism. So this basically means being, I suppose, in a very, very basic way, being a bit selfish and putting your own needs ahead of your families or other people's. So the idea being that you now have more choice over different types of living arrangements or families or household types that we can be a part of. So having more choice means that there's less room for people just to go for that classic conventional choice of let's get married, start a family, and whatever else follows from that. So to kind of like explain this, like why have we got a rising sense of individualism? I mean, this is a really complex subject, but related to marriage and family types and stuff like that, we've changed our attitudes about things. So we no longer consider it only to be acceptable to have to live in a heterosexual married relationship when you're kind of, you know, in your 20s or 30s and those kind of things. Our values are very much different. We now, I suppose, we appreciate happiness more than actual kind of togetherness with somebody else. So for instance, we might look back in the past and say, well, lots of people got married, but were they actually happy in those marriages, or did they just not have an alternative choice? The other thing as well is that we see this this concept called stigma, which is basically a stigma is a negative association you have with something, and we're seeing a great decline in stigma about non-married relationships and people, for instance, living in different family types or even having children outside of wedlock. And this stigma, this negative association, has very much gone, partly because it's becoming more common to have alternative family types, but also because of a decline in religious stigma. And this leads me on to my next point, which is called secularization. So secularization means the decline of importance of religion in society. Now, you might be thinking, well, how does this relate to marriage? Well, marriage is a religious construct. If there was no religion, there would be no marriage. And so as a result of people becoming less religious, they feel less pressure to get married, to do it for religious reasons. So we might describe marriage as no longer being a sacred thing. People don't see it as something they have to do. It's like a rite of passage type thing. The other part of this as well is that divorce has become normalized. Now, why this relates to secularization is that if people are no longer as religious, perhaps they won't feel as much religious pressure to stay together, because when you get married, you make these vows to people to have and to hold, for better for worse, and rich for poorer, until death us do part. And you make that contract. It's a legal contract and also a contract under the eyes of God if you get married in a church or have a religious ceremony. And so if you are no longer religious, the idea of breaking that contract, that lifelong contract you've made with someone, is no longer as much of an issue as it used to be. So divorce has become normalized because people don't believe in God as much. They're not as Christian as they used to be, etc., etc., and so don't feel like they're letting the church or their God down by divorcing, for instance. And I think as well, alongside of this, there's just this less pressure to marry or to not divorce if you're unhappy. So, for instance, if we go back to, I don't know, like 70, 80 years ago, why did people marry? Well, often the kind of cause behind that, I'm not saying the only reason people got married was to have sex, but there was a stigma in society about having sex before marriage, and particularly having children out of wedlock. So if you, you know, 50, 60, 70 years ago had a baby and you weren't married, you'd have incredible religious pressure to get married from society and from religion more generally, to show that it was a legitimate child. Whereas now you might have a baby out of wedlock and think, well, we're happy, we're together, we're solid, we don't need to get married. Policy changes are massive. So I mentioned already, the key thing influencing the rise in divorces over the last sort of 50 years has been the Divorce Reform Act, which came out in 1969, but it only became effective in 1971. Now, the reason I mention this is because often you might get asked to talk about changes that have happened in the last 50 years. Don't worry that the Divorce Reform Act was kind of penned in 1969, because by the time it actually came out, it wasn't until 1971. So if you go back, if you're going to be writing your exams in 2021, when did that exam come out? When did that policy come out? 50 years ago. So that's still good for you to write about for the next couple of years. Same-Sex Marriage Act. Okay, so this has been introduced. It allows gay people to get married. As I mentioned earlier, there's only about 8,000 of these a year, but that is another law that's changed, that's allowed people a change in the marriage rates. And then the last bunch of laws I'm going to look at, the last bunch of policies, are all policies to do with equality. So in 1970, we had the Equal Pay Act. In 1975, we had the Sex Discrimination Act. And in 2010, we had the Equality Act. All of these things help to support particularly women going out to work. Because the key thing with this is, what I'm saying is that before, let's go back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, only 1 in 5 women worked, okay? Now, if we look at it, it's far, far, far more even with men. About 80% of women and about 8% of men working at the moment. Now, these policies allowed women to have a fairer deal at work, i.e. getting equal pay for the equal work. Because before this, it was often quite a common thing for women to be paid lots less than men. So there was an argument about, why should I need to go out to work? Why should I bother? Now we've got these equality policies. The doors have been open for women to go out to work. They get a fair crack of the whip. And why not? Because these days, you don't need to, for women, don't need to get married to have financial independence, whereas that previously was the case. So when women didn't used to work, men used to almost like keep their men used to keep their wives and look after them. Now women have financial independence, can go to work. You don't need to rely on a husband for that financial security. And the final kind of bunch of changes I'm going to look at are what I might consider to be changes in gender roles. So again, going back to that role of women's role in life now means you can go out to work, get an education. That's independence, meaning you do not need to rely on a husband to financially support you. We can also think about the change in expectations of marriage. So what marriage was 60, 50, 60, 70 years ago is very different to what it is now. We might consider it to be a more equal relationship or an emotional contract, rather than, as I said, women marrying to basically become financially secure and those kind of things. But the other thing that's also affected changing gender roles has been the rise of feminism, of course, so women's rights, equality, and also those equality policies that I mentioned earlier, supporting equality. So loads and loads of reasons there why we've had changes in marriage and divorce. But when it comes to like thinking about family diversity, because we talked about this, I talked about this in my second video, which is about different types of families, why we've got them. And this is basically, those reasons that I've just gone through with you are the same reasons you can use to explain why we've got family diversity. So effectively what I'm saying is, if you get a question, which is very possible, to talk about explaining the decline in marriage, or the rise in divorce, or the rise in family diversity, those are the kinds of factors that you can talk about. So the rise in cohabitation, secularisation, less religious stigma, people getting married later in life, legal changes like the Same-Sex Marriage Act, the Divorce Reform Act, rising individualism, so having more choice of household types we can move into, and of course the changing gender roles as well. Now, when we talk about these as being changes in marriage and divorce, what we basically are talking about is, if we've got changes in marriage and divorce, we can have changes in different types of families in society. And it's important to know that whilst those nuclear families are the most common family type in the UK, Those other families, so reconstituted, lone parents, same-sex, beanpole, and cohabiting families, are all on the rise, and they are sort of threatening the position of the nuclear family as the dominant one. But there are also a couple of extra kind of bonus reasons that you'll need to think about to understand fully why we've got more family diversity. So by all means, use those 6 that I've gone through to talk about marriage and divorce and the changes in family diversity, but also have a think about these ones as well. So when we think about family diversity, and we're talking about women having fewer children, we're talking about there being more beanpole families with 1 kid in society. How can we explain this? Well, let's look at the role of birth control and contraception. So kind of interestingly, what I mean by this is things you can use to have sex and not have a baby, basically. Sorry to be patronizing there, but some people might not know what this means. So we're talking about things like the condoms, the pill, the coil, those kind of methods. And these are, in fact, examples of technology, and technology has improved over the time and enabled us to help with contraception and birth control and things like that. And so what's kind of interesting with this is that birth control, like the pill, has not always been freely available. I think it was only introduced in, I think, 1961, and until 1967 was only available for married women. So if you'd had sex and you didn't want to have a baby, you could go and get this morning after pill, but it was only if you were married. So if you weren't married, that wasn't available for you until substantially later. Okay, so what we're talking about there is about being able to have sex but not have children as a result. And the other thing we can mention as well is about cultural diversity and globalization and the role of migration of other types of people and cultures into Britain. And we can talk about Britain being a multicultural society because of these immigration policies, which if you go back to like after the war, that we had a shortage of people, we had a shortage of jobs. So the government encouraged people from ex-colonies, so from the Commonwealth, places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Caribbean, to come over to Britain and work in some of the jobs that were left vacant by people who couldn't no longer do them because they either weren't around because of the war or were injured, or there just wasn't enough people to do them. So what we're talking about here is with this migration of people comes that they don't just bring themselves over, they bring their culture with them as well, and with that culture will become, as I mentioned in the previous videos, archetypal family types. So we might consider extended families to be more associated with Indians, we might associate lone parent families to be more associated with black families, but again, that is a very stereotypical assumption. It can be justified by evidence, but it's another reason that might help you explain why we have alternative family types in society today. So I've gone through an awful lot of stuff in this video, and I just want to kind of click back over a few of the key changes in the last 50 years. So if you ever get a question on sociology of the family that asks you to talk about changes in the last 50 years between marriage, divorce, family diversity, the role of women, anything like that, think about these kind of things. So key changes: declining marriage rates, rising but slowly divorce rates that have kind of settled out. We've got smaller family sizes now. Women are having fewer kids. Remarriage has become more common. People getting married later in life, going through that process of serial monogamy. We've had a rise and a growth of lone parent families. People getting married later in life, even if at all. Cohabitation over marriage, so for things like trial marriages and to avoid wedding costs. Women having kids later in life as well, so waiting until they're a lot older than they used to. And also the idea that same-sex marriage is now legal. So what we've got there is a whole bunch of reasons that have changed the family structure over the last 50, 60 years or so. So just to recap what we went through there, we looked at the declining rates of marriage and the rising rates of divorce, but divorce has kind of leveled off in the last few years, hitting its lowest rate since 1971. We explained some of those marriage changes by looking at the roles of things like policy, the rise in cohabitation, the role of secularisation and declining and sort of changing social attitudes and the changing role of women. We also considered changes and family diversity by thinking about the increase in reproductive technologies and birth control, and also the impact of globalization and of different families moving and migrating to the UK, bringing their culture and their archetypal family types with them. And we just finished off there by considering a whole bunch of those changes in really minor sort of micro form. So there we go. That's the third video done. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. This is quite a long one because I've been going through some of those reasons which are tricky to understand. Now, hopefully they've given you a bit of an idea, or at least kind of reminded you of some of the key things. But as always, if you have any questions about this, just drop me a line. You can email me hello@allsociology.co.uk, or you can get in touch on Instagram @allsociology. Just drop me a line if you need any questions answering. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Once again, as always, if you liked it, if you found it helpful, do me a favor, whack a like on it, subscribe to it, go and visit us over at All Sociology on Instagram and drop us a follow or something like that, or just tell your friends about it. All right, so hopefully that's been helpful for you. Next video, we're going to do another one on family, and then after that, we're going to be moving on towards education. So thanks very much for watching. Take care and peace out. Cheers. Bye-bye.